Palaces were burning, royal courts were going silent. Trade routes that had carried copper, grain, luxury goods, and diplomatic gifts across the eastern Mediterranean were beginning to fail. And the strangest part was this: the great powers were not isolated kingdoms. They were connected. For centuries, Egypt, the Hittite realm, Babylonia, Assyria, Mycenaean Greece, and the wealthy cities of the Levant had been tied together by trade, diplomacy, marriage, and war. Their rulers exchanged envoys and gifts. Scribes used Akkadian as a shared diplomatic language. Merchant ships moved cargo between ports. Chariot armies defended borders. Palace officials counted grain, metal, livestock, and tribute. This was already an international system. The king of Egypt could correspond with rulers hundreds of miles away. The great kings addressed one another as brothers. Bronze weapons depended on metals that often came from distant regions. Wealth moved through networks stretching from the Nile and Anatolia to Mesopotamia and the Aegean. For centuries, this late Bronze Age order had become richer, more interconnected, and more sophisticated. Its rulers built monumental capitals, supported armies, managed bureaucracies, and depended on specialists who could only function because food, metal, labor, and information kept moving. And that is exactly what makes the disaster so difficult to explain, because a system this connected should have had options. A bad harvest in one region might be balanced by imports from another. A threatened city might call on allies. A powerful ruler could move troops or redirect resources. Yet, within a relatively short historical span, multiple parts of that system began to fail. Mycenaean palace centers were destroyed or abandoned. The Hittite imperial structure disappeared. Cities in Syria and Canaan fell. Egypt was forced into major battles against groups arriving by land and sea. Assyria contracted toward its core. Babylonia entered a period of upheaval. It did not happen everywhere in exactly the same way, and it did not happen on one single day. That matters, because if we treat this as one sudden invasion, we miss the deeper mystery. And if we blame only drought, only war, or only migration, we may miss how those pressures reinforced one another. Some states disappeared, others shrank. Others endured, but only after losing territory or influence. So the real puzzle is not simply what destroyed the old order. It is why the same shockwave produced such bruised, different outcomes. To understand what broke, we first have to understand what was holding everything together. And the first major clue comes from Anatolia, where one of the strongest powers of the age did not simply lose a battle. Its imperial center effectively vanished. For centuries, the Hittite Empire dominated much of Anatolia and projected power deep into Syria. Its capital, Hattusa, sat in the heart of central Anatolia. From there, Hittite kings ruled through treaties, vassal states, military campaigns, royal marriages, and a large administrative system. Their empire was powerful enough to challenge Egypt itself. In the 13th century BCE, the two great powers fought for influence in the Levant. Their rivalry produced one of the most famous battles of the ancient world, Kadesh. But eventually, Egypt and Hatti made peace. That peace tells us something important. The late Bronze Age world was not just held together by war, it was held together by negotiation. Great kings exchanged letters. Royal families married across borders. Grain, metals, horses, luxury goods, and diplomatic gifts moved through long-distance networks. The Hittites were deeply embedded in that system, and that meant strength, but also dependence. By the final decades of the Bronze Age, the empire appears to have been under growing pressure. Internal political problems, instability among subject territories, possible food shortages, and disruptions across the wider eastern Mediterranean all weakened the system surrounding Hatti. Then the imperial structure broke. Hattusa was abandoned, and parts of the city were destroyed. Although historians still debate the exact sequence and who or what was responsible, that distinction matters. There is no secure evidence for one dramatic moment when a single invading army simply arrived and erased the Hittite Empire overnight. Instead, what survives suggests something more complicated. Contraction, political fragmentation, disruption, and the disappearance of the central imperial authority. And yet Hittite culture did not vanish completely. In parts of northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, smaller successor states continued traditions that had belonged to the older Hittite world. So when we say the Hittite Empire collapsed, we are talking about the destruction of an imperial system, not the disappearance of every person, language, custom, or political tradition connected to it. That is the first lesson of this wider crisis. A civilization can survive culturally even after the political machine that organized it falls apart. But the Hittites were not alone. Far to the west, across the Aegean, another system depended on palaces, records, redistribution, specialists, and tightly controlled resources. Its rulers lived behind massive stone walls. Its scribes recorded livestock, grain, weapons, land, and labor. And then, those records stopped. Across the Aegean, Mycenaean Greece had become one of the major powers of the late Bronze Age world. Its wealth was concentrated around palace centers. These were more than royal residences. They were the engines of administration, storage, craft production, military organization, and long-distance exchange. The entire system depended on coordination. Resources had to arrive. Officials had to manage them. Craftsmen had to be supported. Trade routes had to remain open. Political authority had to reach beyond the palace walls. When that system worked, it created impressive wealth and power. But complex systems can become fragile when several pressures arrive at once. Around the transition into the 12th century BCE, the Mycenaean palace world began to unravel. Palace centers were destroyed, abandoned, or ceased functioning as they once had. The administrative structure that had organized much of this society disappeared. Long-distance connections weakened. The political landscape fractured. And once again, we have to be careful with the word collapse. The people themselves did not simply vanish. Communities continued. Traditions continued. Life continued. What disappeared was the palace-centered political and economic system that had defined Mycenaean power. That distinction changes the mystery, because this was not the extinction of a population. It was the failure of an institution. And institutions can fail much faster than cultures. Now consider what was happening elsewhere. The Hittite imperial system was breaking apart in Anatolia. Mycenaean palace authority was disappearing in the Aegean. Cities farther east were facing their own crises. Trade routes connecting all of these regions were becoming less reliable. Was this coincidence? Or were these failures connected? That question is where this crisis becomes more than a collection of destroyed cities. It becomes a systems problem. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the moments when entire political orders change in ways that still puzzle historians, because the next evidence brings us even closer to the crisis itself. Along the eastern Mediterranean coast stood wealthy cities that survived by connecting the great powers. They traded with Egypt, they communicated with Anatolia. Their merchants moved through the same maritime networks that tied this world together. And when danger approached, some of those cities were not looking back centuries later trying to explain what happened. They were living through it. The wider trade system was beginning to break, and once those connections failed, even a wealthy city could discover that prosperity had created a dangerous dependence. The late Bronze Age world had become powerful because its great kingdoms were connected. That same connection could also become a weakness. Across the eastern Mediterranean, rulers exchanged envoys, letters, and valuable gifts. Ships moved between ports carrying cargo from distant lands. Great kingdoms depended on bureaucracies that could coordinate resources across enormous territories. For a long time, that network helped maintain stability. Then the network itself began to fail. As political crises spread through Anatolia, the Aegean, and the eastern Mediterranean, cities that depended on larger kingdoms suddenly became more vulnerable. The Hittite Empire had controlled important territories in Syria. But as central Hittite authority disintegrated, dependent cities in the region also began to fall. Farther south, the Canaanite city-states faced growing instability, and the problem was larger than the destruction of individual cities. When one kingdom weakened, merchants lost trading partners. When trade declined, governments lost access to resources and wealth. When governments weakened, they had greater difficulty maintaining armies, administration, and political control. and that could make the next disruption even more damaging. This is why the crisis can look like a domino effect. One crisis did not have to destroy every civilization directly. It only had to weaken one important part of the system. Then the consequences could spread. The international network linking powerful kingdoms through diplomacy and trade had helped produce stability and prosperity. But once the crisis began, those same connections could transmit instability from one region to another. The Mediterranean trade network came undone. Communities that had once benefited from peaceful exchange now faced a very different world. Movement across the sea did not stop. Its character changed. Merchants could become pirates and raiders as the old system broke apart, and desperate appeals for assistance were sent toward Egypt. That tells us something important. People living through the crisis understood that something dangerous was happening around them. But they did not know that later historians would give it one convenient name. To them, there was no neat label. There were failing alliances, disappearing rulers, broken trade routes, food insecurity, violence, migration, and cities trying to survive while neighboring powers were becoming less capable of helping them. Then another group enters the story. Egyptian records describe invaders arriving by land and sea. Later historians would group some of them under a famous label, the Sea Peoples. For generations, they were treated as the obvious villains of the collapse. But the evidence creates a harder question. Were they the force that destroyed this world? Or were they moving through a world that was already breaking? By the time the crisis reached Egypt, the old international order was already coming apart. Mycenaean society had collapsed in Greece. The Hittite Empire had disintegrated in Anatolia. Cities dependent on those larger powers were falling across Syria. Trade across the Mediterranean was breaking down. Then Egypt faced the danger directly. Groups of invaders were moving south through an already unstable region, arriving by both land and sea. Later historians would call them the Sea Peoples. The name sounds simple. The reality was not. These were not necessarily one nation moving under one ruler with one clear objective. And the wider crisis had already begun before they entered the story. That matters because for generations, the Sea Peoples have often been treated as if they provide the entire explanation. Invaders appeared, cities burned, civilizations collapsed, case closed. But the sequence is much messier. Severe drought had already contributed to crop failure and famine. Some populations rebelled against ruling elites. Others moved in search of food. Political order weakened. Trade broke down. Raiding increased. And then Egypt was forced to fight groups arriving through an already destabilized region. The Egyptian king fought them on land and at sea. Egypt resisted, but surviving a battle is not the same as escaping a collapse. Egypt's power was badly weakened afterward. It withdrew from the Levant, abandoning much of the influence it had previously exercised there. And once Egyptian control receded, Canaanite city-states faced their own collapse. The shockwave continued inland. Assyria contracted back toward its geographic core. Babylonia lost its ruling dynasty. Elam entered a long period of fragmentation and decline. This is the point where the mystery changes, because now we can see that the crisis did not produce one identical result everywhere. The Hittite imperial system disappeared. Mycenaean palace society collapsed. Egypt fought through the crisis, but emerged weakened. Assyria contracted. Babylonia suffered political upheaval. Different societies were struck by the same wider instability, yet they did not all break in the same way. So the question is no longer only, what caused the collapse? The more important question is, why could one state bend under the pressure while another shattered? Why could one political system retreat toward its core while another lost the institutions that held it together? And if the Sea Peoples were only one part of the crisis, then what actually separated the survivors from the casualties? Egypt survived, but survival did not mean victory. By the end of the crisis, the kingdom still existed, yet its power beyond the Nile had been badly reduced. Egypt withdrew from the Levant, and the wider imperial system it had helped dominate was no longer what it had been. That makes Egypt different from the Hittite Empire. Hatti lost its central imperial structure. Egypt retained a functioning kingdom, and Assyria presents another kind of survival. As instability spread deeper inland, Assyria contracted back toward its geographic core. It became smaller, its influence narrowed, but it did not disappear. Babylonia experienced another outcome. Its ruling dynasty fell during the upheaval, yet Mesopotamian political life continued beyond the crisis. Elam, meanwhile, entered a prolonged period of fragmentation and decline. Put these outcomes side by side, and one thing becomes clear. There was no single version of collapse. Some imperial systems vanished. Some states lost territory. Some ruling dynasties fell. Some regions fragmented. And some political centers survived long enough to rebuild in a different world. That is why the phrase civilization collapsed can be misleading if we imagine entire populations simply disappearing. The crisis was often about institutions. Palaces stopped functioning. Imperial authority weakened. Trade connections failed. Rulers lost control of territory. Old political relationships broke apart. But people remained. Communities adapted. New political systems eventually emerged. And this uneven pattern gives us an important clue. If one invading force had simply swept across the entire region and destroyed everything in the same way, we might expect the results to look more similar. They do not. Instead, different societies responded differently to a wider chain of crises. Egypt could still fight. Assyria could retreat toward its core. Other systems, such as the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean palace order, did not preserve their old political structure. So survival depended on more than whether a society encountered violence. It depended on how much pressure its political system could absorb while the surrounding network was failing. And that brings us to the most important part of the entire mystery. Because we have now seen the victims. We have seen the survivors. We have seen famine, migration, rebellion, warfare, disrupted trade, and political fragmentation. But which one actually caused the collapse? The answer may be uncomfortable, because there may never have been one cause at all. If there was no single cause, then the collapse has to be understood as a chain reaction. Severe drought, crop failure, famine, rebellion, migration, raiding, war, and the breakdown of trade. Any one of these could damage a kingdom. Together, they could become devastating. Start with food. If drought reduced harvests, rulers had less grain to redistribute. That weakened one of the basic foundations of palace power. When food became scarce, ordinary people faced pressure first. Communities could move. Subjects could lose faith in rulers who were supposed to maintain order, and political instability could deepen. Now add migration. Groups searching for food, security, or new territory could place further pressure on neighboring regions. Some might settle peacefully. Others might raid. Some could join larger movements of displaced people already crossing the eastern Mediterranean. Then add war. Rulers were forced to defend borders while their economic base was weakening. Armies required food. Chariots required horses, craftsmen, equipment, and organized supply. Palaces needed scribes, administrators, workers, and access to resources. A state under pressure had to support all of this at the exact moment its revenues and trade connections were becoming less reliable. Then the trade network began to fail. That made the crisis worse. The great powers did not produce everything they needed locally. They depended on exchange. They depended on shipping. They depended on other kingdoms remaining stable enough to trade. So when one important partner collapsed, the problem did not stay local. It traveled. A disrupted port could hurt merchants. Lost trade could hurt palace revenues. Reduced revenues could weaken armies. A weaker army could lose territory. Lost territory could reduce food and resources even further. That is how a crisis becomes a feedback loop. And this is why the Sea Peoples cannot automatically be treated as the single answer. They appear inside an already destabilized world. They may have intensified destruction. They may have exploited weakness. Some groups may themselves have been moving because other regions were already under pressure. The evidence does not allow us to reduce them to one simple role. The same caution applies to drought. Severe drought may have formed part of the chain of crisis, but drought alone does not explain every kingdom. The same applies to rebellion. The same applies to invasion. The same applies to trade failure. The strongest explanation is not one isolated disaster. It is interaction. Environmental stress weakens food security. Food insecurity increases social pressure. Social pressure fuels migration and rebellion. Migration and rebellion increase instability. Instability disrupts trade. Trade disruption weakens governments. Weak governments become more vulnerable to warfare, and warfare makes every other problem harder to solve. Once enough parts of the system begin failing at the same time, the strength created by interconnection becomes a weakness. The crisis spreads faster. The old order loses the ability to recover. And that finally brings us to the question promised from the beginning. When this world unraveled, who actually survived? The Hittite Empire did not survive as an empire. Its central authority disappeared, even though Hittite traditions continued in smaller successor states. The Mycenaean palace system did not survive either. Palaces that had organized administration, storage, production, and political power ceased functioning. Communities remained, but the old political order was gone. Egypt survived. Its kingdom endured the crisis, but its power was reduced. It withdrew from the Levant and no longer dominated the eastern Mediterranean as it had before. Assyria survived too. It contracted toward its geographic core, losing much of its wider reach. But the state itself endured. Babylonia experienced serious upheaval. Its ruling dynasty fell, yet Mesopotamian political civilization continued. Elam entered a prolonged period of fragmentation and decline. So the answer to who survived depends on what we mean by survival. Some populations remained after their governments vanished. Some states kept their political identity but lost territory and influence. Others broke into smaller successor societies. The crisis did not erase the ancient Near East. It reorganized it. And that brings us back to the question we started with. Why did so many civilizations fall apart around the transition into the 12th century BCE? The evidence does not point to one universal destroyer. It points to several crises interacting at once. Drought and crop failure placed pressure on food supplies. Famine increased instability. People moved. Rebellions and warfare spread. Trade routes broke down. Palace governments lost resources. And once those governments weakened, they became even less capable of responding to the next crisis. The international system that had made the late Bronze Age prosperous also meant that trouble in one region could spread into another. That may be the central lesson. Complexity creates strength, but it can also create dependence. And when enough connected parts begin failing together, even powerful kingdoms can discover that they are not as secure as they appear. The Bronze Age ended, but civilization did not. Farmers still worked the land. Craftsmen still made tools. Merchants still traded where they could. Religious traditions continued. New rulers emerged. And from the fractured political landscape of the 12th century BCE, a different world slowly began to take shape. The Iron Age. New kingdoms would rise. Old powers would recover. And some states that had barely survived the catastrophe would eventually become stronger than before. The world had unraveled, but history was already beginning to rebuild it.